All right, yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Today should be a pretty easy day. I know a lot of you have plans to sleep this weekend, have plans to catch up on work this weekend, so maybe we'll get out of here a little early. First things first, I want to know, and remember this wasn't required, so it's fine if you didn't, but did anyone get the chance to log on to After seminar last night? Well, I did, and I thought it was really cool. One of the things that really struck me about what she's talking about was, and she sort of talked about her work in Expecting Better and the book she's written since, but she also talked about some of the more recent work she's done with COVID. And a couple things really struck me about her discussion last night. One was her emphasis on how anyone can understand this, right? You don't need a PhD in economics or statistics or data science to sit back and think, what are the mechanisms at play? What are the hidden biases at play? How might I understand these data and make a decision with them? And I know at the beginning of the semester, a bunch of you expressed some concerns about, the math inherent in data-driven decisions. And I hope that as the semester has gone on, you're getting more comfortable with more of the philosophy behind making decisions with data. The other thing that really struck me about what she was talking about was the difference between academic writing and science communication. And I think a lot of what we're doing in this class falls in that latter group, communicating science both to one another, but also receiving science communication. Before we start our discussion of today's chapter, I wanted to go back a couple days, because we had talked a little bit about how collecting data might have some ethics behind it, and some of the things we might want data on might be unethical to collect those data. So for instance, it's not a good idea, generally speaking, to shoot pregnant women up with a bunch of caffeine or alcohol or something harder like heroin, even though those data in a randomized control setting might be valuable. It might be valuable to know the effects of these things on the mother and the fetus. But it wouldn't be ethical to invite people into a lab and do this to them. And earlier this week, when we were talking about selection bias, some of those ethics in data collection issues came up, but they were a little bit more hidden. So I don't know if we do this at Sweetbriar, in part because we have a very small psych program, only 2 faculty members. But one of the things they talked about in that Birds from West chapter was psych experiments and collecting psych data as sort of a convenience sample. They talked about how this convenience sample is often weird in the sense of Western and educated and rich and developed. But one of the things that they didn't leave out, and this is true 40 miles up the road at UVA, it's true at the bigger research universities, is psych students often have to participate in experiments for course credit. And this is sort of a big difference between sort of the way psych conducts experiments and the way, say, econ conducts experiments. And so an economist like me might say that's really coercive, forcing people to participate in experiments for credit, which I might say is an unethical means of data collection. Tim and Jessica over in Guyon might disagree with me. I'm not saying they do or don't, I don't actually know their opinions on this, but the way psych in general collects data tends to be different than the way other fields collect data. And this is important for when we're reading studies and how we, as just regular people, conclude things from these data. But because we were talking about selection bias, we might see some other forms of hidden bias stem from that. Are people who take psych classes different? Are people who care about their grade in psych classes different than the people who are taking psych classes but not showing up to those experiments, even though you get course credit from them? Are the people showing up to the experiments doing so only for the course credit, in the sense that maybe what we're seeing is some sort of experimenter demand effect? And what I mean by experimenter demand is, if I'm forced to take a psych experiment for course credit, my goal is not to do A, B, and C that the experiment wants to find out. My goal is to get out of that room as fast as possible without it negatively impacting my grade. So suppose I'm in a psych experiment and the experiment is fill out a survey. I might fill out every left bubble in the survey, turn it in and leave the room, take my course credit and go home. Other people might try and see past the experiment, try and think, oh, this is what the experimenter wants me to say in this experiment, and answer that way, even though it might not be something I believe. This is all just sort of sidebar to what we've been talking about, but selection effects and hidden bias in science, in data, are really rampant and also hidden, and there's a lot more to them than we might see at first blush. Any questions or comments so far? Cool, so let's start the class proper. Let's talk about what we read for last night, Oster chapter 12. Who wants to summarize it really quickly for us? In the back, is that Jaden? Yeah. All right. I'm slowly learning names. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please go ahead.
So basically, she starts talking about workouts and yoga and kegels and insomnia and kind of some of the research behind it. Is it good? Is it bad? And throughout the whole thing, there's a common pattern. There's not really enough research. There's not enough information. But the little information we have points towards, like, oh, there's not information that says on your right side, but there's information that says on your left side can't hurt you. And a lot of it was discussing, like I know she was discussing limits as far as like not pushing yourself, because doing like little things here and there won't hurt. But one of the analogies she makes is like an Olympic athlete is going to be harmful. That's what I got from the chapter.
Great job. And for anyone who didn't hear Jaden, this chapter introduces a couple things during pregnancy. It introduces the question of whether or not you should be exercising and also how much. It introduces how you should be sleeping, not just how much and getting good sleep, restful sleep for the baby, but also positions. Anyone want to add anything to that summary? All right. So what struck me right away is this chapter presents an interesting trade-off, an interesting tension, right? We know that pregnancy is painful, or at the very least, discomfortable, uncomfortable. And we know that exercise is good for you. But there's really this interesting tension there, where exercise might make that discomfort, make that pain worse, and also there's some more interaction between that tension, where exercise is not as straightforward as it would be absent of pregnancy, right? You want not just to stay healthy for yourself and that fetus, but also there's limits, restrictions on how you can exercise, how intense it can be. So what did you guys take from this exercise component? What do you guys think about it? Yeah, see that.
One thing I thought was interesting was that she brought up in concern with exercise, how like the studies will kind of, they're pretty hazy, but that there's not necessarily like what exercises are good or not. And then when she brought up yoga, in like traditional yoga, there are exercises that yoga positions that you should do or should not do when pregnant, and it's like part of the knowledge of it. So I thought that was interesting.
Right, and for anyone who didn't hear Sarah, what she said was, a lot of the research around exercise is kind of hazy. I found this kind of compelling for a couple of reasons. One, it goes back to what we were talking about, which is, what are these variables we're measuring? You know, exercise is a broad and vague term. Are we measuring, heartbeat? Are we measuring miles run? Are we measuring, muscles exerted? There's a lot of different ways to think about exercise, and it's going to have interesting impacts on how we interpret the data. I also found it compelling because it hinted at some other stuff we've been talking about, which is when we don't know how to interpret the data, it helps if we have some sort of mechanism at play. In this case, it might be biological or physiological, right? We know what exercise does for the cardiovascular system. So even though we might not understand fully the effects of exercising while pregnant, we can start to learn a little bit more from the data by understanding the biological pathways at play. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think about this exercise bit? Yeah, and remind me of your name, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm.
I thought it was really interesting how like the students talked about what exercise she was doing. When she talked about this, but when she talked about what she did during her pregnancy, she was so worried about overdoing it. And then her husband looked at her and he was like, I saw how fast you were going. There's no way you were overdoing it. But like it felt different to her than what it looked like and what it would have been before her pregnancy.
Right, excellent point. For anyone who didn't hear Vicky, like part of what's going on here with this exercise is really the subjective experience. So it's not just the fact that she's walking very, very slowly on a treadmill, but it feels like exertion. What about the rest of you? What did you guys think? So Sita, you started hinting at all of the limited data there are on pregnancy and exercise. Some of it's on yoga, and I particularly like this part for many reasons. One, much like Emily Oster, I dislike yoga. But two, I think it gets at some of the conditions of data that we want to help analyze. So what do you guys think about the yoga part in particular? Yeah, Cynthia.
I feel like yoga is just like not a cop out, but I feel like in terms of exercising as when you're pregnant, I feel like yoga is an easy go to because you don't take that as a very hardcore exercise. It's more of a stretching exercise. So I feel like that's why there might be more information on yoga because it's the quote unquote easiest to do.
Right, at some point, and there's a really sort of profound thing there, which is how the data get to us. How do we have more information on prenatal yoga than we do on, say, running? It might be because prenatal yoga is so easy to both practice but also observe. What about the rest of you, this yoga section? What do you guys think? So one of the things that struck me about the yoga section was, again, this search for mechanisms. Yoga, prenatal yoga, seems to be good for the fetus, for the birth process, and it doesn't really make sense why. But from a scientific perspective, we can start to develop some mechanisms that might help to explain the data we're getting. Maybe it has to do with stretching the pelvic floor. Maybe it has to do with visualizing a happy pregnancy. What does visualizing a happy pregnancy look like? We don't know. It's important to think about that, and certainly, as she says, self-actualization is a good thing. But it's sort of harder to place in a scientific context. We can't really, run data-driven decisions on it. At the end of the day, it looks like prenatal yoga is helping, but we're not as clear on what we're learning. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think? Yeah.
This is maybe a looser connection, but breathing is also extremely important in yoga, and also like when one is giving birth, that is always a huge component. So I think that could also potentially play in that yoga teaches you how to breathe well.
Excellent point, yeah. And this search for underlying mechanisms is really going to help us make decisions in a data-driven world, right? It's not just looking at the study at its surface. So many people participated in prenatal yoga exercise. They had a less painful birth. But why might that be the case? It might be the stretching. It might be the self-actualization. It might be the breathing exercises that you learn and master. Yeah, really. At some point, so maybe it's not what you learn in a prenatal yoga class, but people who take prenatal yoga might be more likely to take yoga more generally, which might suggest some sort of pre-existing health, pre-existing fitness, perhaps pre-existing wealth, perhaps pre-existing body consciousness. So maybe there's some reverse causality there. How do we get around reverse causality? Well, one of the things we can do is start an RCT. And there were a couple RCTs that were mentioned here. Both of them happen to take place in Taiwan. One was on exercise with Olympians, or potential Olympians, and the other was on this prenatal yoga. So what are we learning from these RCTs? And remember, RCT means randomized controlled trial. What did you guys take away from it? Yeah.
One of the things that I did notice was that they were reporting their own pain and discomfort levels, and that kind of made me think, like, did they get a baseline before they were pregnant, or did they just find pregnant women? Because I feel like a lot of people have different pain levels, and you get the comments saying, like, I don't know how you're feeling. And so that was one thing I noticed, but it does say that it did reduce labor time, which, like, someone can, say, I feel like it reduced the labor time, that's more statistical, but I did notice that one part was the person reporting how they felt.
At some point, yeah, this self-reported data might be problematic. What if you're really tough and you just don't want to say when you're in pain? Alternatively, what if you're just a wuss and you're going to say everything is super painful? But there's something deeper there, something a little more profound, and we'll talk about this next week when we get to potential outcomes in experimental design, which is because these trials are randomized, you would expect that, on average, even if Jaden has a different subjective experience of pain than I do, you'd expect that once we randomize us into groups, it's not about the pain, but like you said, measuring at baseline, that change in pain. Are we seeing a reduction in pain, even if your pain baseline is a 7 and mine is a 5? What about the study with Olympians? What do you guys think of that? Who wants to remind us what that study was about? So what we saw in that study, remember, was strenuous exercise in these potential Olympians didn't seem to be particularly problematic for a pregnancy. But when we're looking at pregnant potential Olympians, right away some red flags should be going on. What do you guys think about a study with Olympians? Yeah, Juliet.
You have to consider that their body condition does vary from the average person.
So Olympians probably look a lot different than the average person. Now, is that problematic in general? Yeah, Riley.
I mean, I know are like, you're very, very fit and very athletic. I feel like the data gathered from that can't really be applied to the general population. And I don't want to say useless, but it's just not as useful.
Excellent point, yeah. Olympians are very fit, very athletic. The data gathered from them might not be as generalizable to our population overall. But was it problematic in context of the study that she wrote about? What do you guys think? Remember, the purpose of that study was not to look at general people, it was to look at people with high athletic ability and high athletic output. Yeah, Elizabeth.
It reminds me also of, like, one of the caffeine studies, I think, where you're looking at, like, your consumption before and after pregnancy. So it's kind of similar, where it's like, can you maintain, like, what you were doing before you were pregnant, rather than it being, like, a universal standard for all pregnant women?
Excellent point, yeah. For anyone who doesn't hear Elizabeth, it kind of reminded her of the caffeine study, where it's not about, can you go out and run 12 miles? It's about, can you maintain your level of output that you were doing before, which is a great way to think about the general population, right? We might also think that one of the things it's doing, again, this is decisions in a data-driven world, we might think that one of the things this is doing is putting sort of an upper bound on it. So suppose the study told us something different. Suppose it told us that Olympians could not maintain their general level of exercise. Well, they can't do it, and like Juliet noted, like Riley noted, these are people at peak physical condition. That might be a bad sign for what I can do. We've talked a little bit about mechanisms. One of the things that's closely related to mechanisms that's going to help us interpret data is this concept of dosage. And dosage sounds a lot like medicine, and that's where the term comes from. But we can think of dosage in other ways. We can think of it just as a level of exposure. And dosage effects should make some amount of sense to us. We're going to see this in a few minutes when we talk about the sleep study. But if exercise is bad for, say, an Olympian, it's probably going to be bad for me, who is not in shape at baseline. At some point about baseline J, right? We should expect, it doesn't have to be linear, but we should expect some sort of relation between the people who are in our data set and the people who aren't. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? So then in mind, let's fast forward. What were we learning about sleep from this chapter? This is a pretty short chapter, so we should be able to get out of here decently early. What did we learn about sleep? Beth, what did we learn about sleep from this chapter?
It talks about the different positions and it talks about the different positions and the data which is sleep.
Alright, so the sleep part of this chapter, first we learn about working out, then we learn about sleep. Talks a little bit about the different positions. In general, there's side sleeping and back sleeping. And what we can learn about that and what it means for the health of the fetus. Yeah, Lily, is that a hand?
It basically would do probably on certain things, and but it's pretty inconclusive. And it showed that one said that you should sleep on your side, but then others saw that lying on your back was not effective at all. So it was really like, whatever was best for you.
Excellent point. Let's unpack that a little bit because this gets at what we've been talking about with mechanism effects. Why might back sleeping be problematic? Well, there's a physiological reason. When you sleep on your back, you pinch certain blood vessels, which might restrict blood flow to your uterus and in turn to the fetus. There might be a mechanism there to explain why back sleeping is problematic. But, really, to your point, when we unpack the data, it's kind of inconclusive. It's helpful to understand the path to which we can interpret the data. Jaden, is that a hand or a stretch? If it wasn't a hand, you don't.
It wasn't.
Okay. Anything you'd like to share? The answer could be no.
No.
So what do you guys think about this sleep part of the chapter?
It's very inconclusive. My opinion, I feel like she states her opinion, she provides evidence, but I feel like there's never necessarily a conclusion whether she's proving herself right or wrong. I felt like if that chapter in specific was
Right, excellent point. So the data on sleep position are largely inconclusive. There was some information on sleep position, though, which I think we can critique learning the skills that we've been talking about the past couple weeks. So back sleeping was somewhat associated with one specific outcome in pregnancy. Who remembers what that was? So sleeping on your back, the sleep position, Cedar, you had a hand?
Yeah, doesn't it just slow or stop blood flow?
So that was a possible mechanism effect, but what we see as an end result, the outcome, was that back sleeping is associated somewhat with increased stillbirths. But Emily unpacks this a little bit because we might have a selection problem. We might have a problem with the way those data are coming to us. Who wants to critique that finding? Why did we see that result that we saw? That sleeping on your back might be slightly associated with increased stillbirth. So when you guys are thinking about this and thinking back to your reading, when you were pregnant, and I know it sounds weird coming from me, but roll with me on this. When you were pregnant, your body becomes a thermonuclear reactor. Sleeping becomes very difficult. You're very hot. You're very uncomfortable. But what we saw in the book was that sleeping on your back is associated with increased stillbirth. And Emily Oster said, these data might not be as conclusive as they look at first blush. Why was that? So Sita, you raised an interesting possible mechanism. It might be reduced blood flow to the fetus. And that's because when you sleep on your back, you pinch a certain blood vessel, restricts blood flow. But there could be another reason. What the book points out is it could be a case of reverse causality. It could be the fetus is already a stillborn, the fetus is already dead, and because of that, it's much more comfortable to sleep on your back. Then none of us are experts in physiology yet, but in understanding these mechanisms, we can also start to unpack some of the hidden biases behind the data. And remember, when we say bias, it doesn't have to be intentional. It doesn't have to be malicious. When we say bias, it just means, are there anything in the data, hidden or otherwise, that are going to change the conclusions we can learn? Questions on that part? Because it's a little subtle, it's a little profound, but what we might see in these data are cases of reverse causality. The outcome, in this case stillbirth, causing the treatment, in this case back sleeping, and not vice versa. There was another part that the sleep chapter talked about, or the sleep half of the chapter, and that was medicine. Again, when you're pregnant, your body becomes very hot, thermonuclear reactor, it becomes very uncomfortable to sleep. Sleep is obviously good for you. Sleep is obviously good for the fetus. So a lot of people think, well, it's hard to sleep. What can I do about that? Maybe I can take some sleep aids. Did we learn anything about sleep aids in this chapter? Yeah, Jaden.
I did notice that she talked about over-the-counter medication, and she classified it as like class B.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of interesting to me because I didn't realize. I don't know if that's a pregnancy thing or a regular medication thing as far as the classification, but I thought that was interesting.
Right, so picture someone who's pregnant, very hot, very uncomfortable, very difficult to sleep. They want to know, can I run to CVS? Can I run to Walgreens? Can I get something over the counter? Well, it turns out, even though it sounds kind of scary, this is a drug that knocks you out, that the most popular over-the-counter sleep medication, Unisom, is perfectly safe as scheduled by whatever, classifying body this is. But there are other ways to go to sleep that aren't necessarily Unisom. What are they? Yeah, Madison.
Are you talking about like
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe you need some more help sleeping than just a Unisom tablet. What about something like Ambien? Something that requires a prescription that's pretty strong. What did we learn about Ambien? I'm seeing a lot of blank faces, and then it's good because what we learned about Ambien from this chapter was not much, which is, Riley, you were hinting at that earlier when you were talking about the conclusions we could draw. But at the end of the day, we get some sort of dosage effect like we were talking about earlier, which is we know that Unisom is safe. We know that Ambien is stronger than Unisom. It stands to reason, though we don't have all the data to back this up, we can draw a dosage implication from it, that Ambien is probably a little less safe than Unisom. It might be a lot less safe, we don't know yet. But it stands to reason that Ambien is less safe than Unison. So we don't learn a lot in these data right now, because Unison is perfectly safe, and the data on Ambien are inconclusive, but we can imagine a universe, we can imagine a situation where, what if Unison wasn't perfectly safe? What if it was slightly less safe? That would imply that Ambien is even more or less safe. Or we can imagine a situation where we have information on Ambien. What if Ambien is perfectly safe? We would expect that Unison is also perfectly safe because it's less dangerous than Ambien. So in understanding how these different things are related to one another, we can start to narrow down what we can draw from the data. Narrow down our conclusions even if they aren't perfectly conclusive. Any questions so far? So what did you guys think of this chapter? Just overall impressions. Yeah. Hey.
I think what it comes down to, which she said a lot, is that even though you're pregnant, it still shouldn't stop you from doing the things that you've been doing. I think you still have to listen to your own body. And if something is causing like you personal pain, probably shouldn't do it again, but it shouldn't stop you from doing it.
Right, and Peyton, your point speaks to Jamie's point from earlier, which is a lot of this experience that we're learning about, even though there might be data to back it up, a lot of this experience is really subjective. And in fact, one of the reasons we might not have a lot of data, in part to it being so subjective, is we're not going to be able to collect a lot of information. Who was it earlier who said? Vicky, you mentioned how even though it might feel like you're working out really hard, you're going really slow on the treadmill, right? So why might we not have a lot of good data on the state of strenuous exercise on a pregnancy? It's because there's something mechanical that's stopping us from exercising too strenuously. It's hard, it's painful, it's difficult. So James, your point about listening to your body, we can learn a lot from our own subjective experience on top of what the data are telling us. What about the rest of you? What did you think about this chapter? Yeah, Madison. Yeah, excellent point. And a lot of what we learned from this chapter were things were inconclusive. But let me gently push back, because I wouldn't say it was missing data. I would say the state of knowledge is missing data. You know, the book is reporting the data that are available. Does that make sense? Is that distinction meaningful to you? Like the difference between, it's not like there's a study out there that the book is failing to report. That would be missing data to me. This is the data that exists are less informative. Yeah, Riley, it's not him.
And then I kind of like step back and was like, well, okay, it's frustrating for me as a not pregnant person. I'm how frustrated for pregnant people if they don't have this data.
Yeah, excellent point. And you know, this is outside the scope of our semester, but wait until you get to her next book, right? Because a lot of the pregnancy research is just how does this activity affect the viability of the pregnancy, right? So if you eat lunch meat, you get listeria. If you drink, does the baby get fetal alcohol poisoning? But when you get to her next book, which is really about raising the kid and toddlers, you know, the data are much less inconclusive because it's not about, you know, the viability of the pregnancy anymore. It's what's the difference between breastfeeding and formula? What's the difference between co-sleeping and crib sleeping? What's the difference between all these things where what we're concerned about is my kid going to grow up well? Which is a vaguely defined concept, but something that those of us who want kids all care about. But the data are much less inconclusive, or much less conclusive, I should say. So yeah, I understand that it can be frustrating to read it when it comes to exercising and sleep studies. But in getting these tools we have with the data now, we can make, and it doesn't have, we'll say this throughout the class, but we're using the setting of pregnancy to talk more generally about decisions in a data-driven world. In some cases, there's going to be a lot of good data. Some cases, there's going to be ill-defined data. Some cases, there might be no data at all. how can we make decisions in these various cases? What about the rest of you? What do you guys think of this chapter? What were your impressions of it? Yeah, see that.
I also thought that this chapter is the least solidly formed one that we have read, but we just talked about how there's always still lack of data. It's also just the same thing where it's like amount of exercise is not measured really, similar to caffeine. So it's like the small amount that is probably most doable by the average pregnant person, we don't have adequate information on.
Excellent point, yeah. And let me, I understand the frustration when the chapter doesn't really have clear-cut conclusions. But that's going to be a theme throughout this book, so get used to it, for lack of a better term, right? The point is, what can we learn from the data that are out there? And in some cases, we're going to have small samples. That's problematic. In some cases, we're going to have highly selected samples. Why might that be problematic? It's our job to critique these studies, to critique these data as they're arriving to us. So yeah, it sort of sucks that at the end of the day, we're not really necessarily making a decision. We're not going, oh, I'm going to sleep on my side Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I'm going to sleep on my back Monday, Friday. Switch off every other weekend. You know, that would be really cool to read. That would be a very conclusive thing to read. But data are very murky. The field of data work in econ is called econometrics. And you'll hear econometricians talk about how it's as much an art as it is a science. And you'll hear people who are not econometricians call it mountains of garbage, right? Like, it's really hard to do good data work because there's, as you guys mentioned Wednesday, our personal subjectivity coming into play. As we learned Wednesday, hidden biases that are even more difficult to discern. As we learned last week, randomized controlled trials might often be unethical, so we can't run an RCT. This is a really interesting point in the semester for us because this is sort of a turning point. What we're doing right now is finishing up sort of our background information on bias, on subjectivity, on science, and how we understand numbers overall. Next week, we start with potential outcomes, and we really get more into the spirit of causality. And how, remember, this is a leadership class, what we as leaders can learn from causal inferences in the data. Did I see a hand out there? So what do you guys think? What are some big, let's wrap class up on this. Like I said, it's a short chapter. We can get out kind of early today. But what are some big lessons you took from this chapter? Yeah, Jaden.
I think, what everyone's talking about, it goes back to in her introduction, where she talks about just gain as much data as you can and choose your own pluses and minuses, whether, because I feel like the data is normally supporting, it's just more of, is it, like, I don't know, is it harming? It's not necessarily supporting, but is it harming either?
Excellent point. And we talked about this at the beginning of the semester, right? Science is not about proof, which is a common misconception. Science is more about disproof. Are the data leading us away from drawing a particular conclusion? I want to say Jackie?
Yeah.
All right.
I think this whole chapter is just a reminder to kind of how difficult it is to create these studies and take them on. And just how many confounding variables happen in these studies. It's hard, especially with pregnancy, you're kind of do look at things at that point. And it just reminds me of like the whole nature versus nurture dilemma and how that can impact their lives, and we don't really know for certain, or probably won't know.
Excellent point. And yeah, like I said, I understand the frustration. I'm glad you guys are getting to that conclusion where sometimes we can't draw that many conclusions from the data. But now that we're getting into the second part of the semester and we get to talk more about causality, we'll start seeing ways we can get around it. Yeah, there might not be an RCT, but maybe there's something that we'll come to learn as a natural experiment. We're going to see these with things like COVID. We're going to see these with things like crime. We're going to see these with things like pregnancy and the health and viability of a fetus, right? Things that the data and the decisions we make with these data are really important to us. So how can we get around these concepts? Any final thoughts to take us home? All right, so one big lesson that I took away was what we've been talking about with mechanism effects. One big lesson that I took away was what we've been talking about with dosage effects. But overall, what I want you guys to be thinking about this weekend is, if these data are inconclusive, what are some interesting and perhaps innovative ways we can try and learn stuff? So with that, like I said, it's a short chapter. I promised you we could go home early. I hope everyone has a healthy, happy, safe weekend. I look forward to reading all your essays. Please email me if you have anything that you're struggling with in the class or want to talk about anything. And happy birthday to Beth.